I watched him with each new wife. The pattern was always the same. He would see her, in the congregation, at a gathering, walking past our house, and something would shift in his eyes, a hunger. Not the soft, wondering hunger of the boy who used to touch my face like I was made of light, but something sharper, something that wanted to possess. He would pray, he would fast, and then he would come to me or to one of the other sisters and tell us, "God has revealed her to me. She is meant to be sealed to me for eternity. This is His will, not mine." And I would watch him go to her. I would watch him touch her face the way he'd touched mine on our wedding night. I would watch him whisper to her the same words he'd whispered to me. "You are my greatest love. I see God in you. The others don't understand like you do." And I would see her believe him, the way I had believed him, because he was so tender, so reverent, so convinced that what he was doing was holy. But then, weeks or months later, I would see the tenderness fade. His eyes would begin to wander again. He would spend less time with her. He would move to the next room, the next wife, the next revelation. And I understood. He wasn't lying. He genuinely believed that God was commanding him. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped being able to tell the difference between God's voice and his own hunger. The visions were real. I knew they were. I had felt the presence myself when we spoke in tongues, when heaven moved through us like wind through open doors. But Joseph had touched something sacred and couldn't leave it alone. He kept reaching, kept claiming, kept trying to own what was meant to be witnessed, not possessed. I still loved him. God help me, I still loved him. Not the prophet. Not the man who moved between our beds with steady hands and revelations that always justified what he already wanted, but the boy. The one who used to cry because he felt overwhelmed by the beauty of the world. The one who held me on our wedding night and trembled because he couldn't believe he'd been trusted with something so precious. That boy was still in there somewhere. I could see him sometimes. In the way Joseph held our daughters, in the way he sang hymns at night, in the rare moments when his face went soft and wondering again. But those moments grew fewer, and the prophet, the one with the steady hand and the unshakable certainty, grew stronger. The tragedy wasn't that he was evil. The tragedy was that he had been touched by something real and it had corrupted him. Or maybe he had corrupted it. I don't know. All I know is this. The boy who trembled had been afraid of his own unworthiness. The man who stopped trembling had learned to call his hunger holy. And in learning not to tremble, he had lost something essential. The humility that comes from knowing you are small in the presence of the infinite. He had touched the divine. But instead of letting it transform him, he had tried to use it to transform the world into something that served him. I watched his hands stop trembling, and I realized he was no longer trembling because he no longer doubted. He had learned to use the language of the sacred to justify his desire. And the cost of that learning was the boy I had loved, the one who reached for my hand when heaven touched him, the one who wept because he felt unworthy of what he'd been given. That boy was gone. And in his place was a man who believed that everything he wanted was what God wanted too. But something else was happening too. Something real. The sisters and we began to gather in secret, not with him, just us. We would sit in a circle, hands joined, and we would pray. And sometimes, when the prayer deepened, we would speak in tongues. It started with one of the younger wives. Her voice rose not English, not any language we knew, but something older. Something that moved through her body like wind through trees. And then another sister joined. And another. Until all of us were speaking syllables pouring from our mouths like water from a spring. It felt sacred. It felt real. Not like Joseph's revelations, which always seemed to serve him, but like something that had no agenda, no doctrine, no command, Just presence, just communion, just us. The third time we gathered, something broke open inside me. We sat in our circle, 7 of us that night, hands joined, palms pressed together, warm and slightly damp. I could feel Sarah's pulse beating fast in her wrist, where my thumb rested. I could smell the lavender oil Emma had rubbed into her hair. The room was dim, just 2 candles burning, casting shadows that moved like living things across the walls. We began to pray, soft at first, then deeper. Then the words stopped making sense and became something else, sounds rising from our throats like water finding its way through stone. My mouth opened, and what came out was not English, not any language I'd been taught. The syllables tasted like copper and honey, like salt water, like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 1,000 years. My body began to shake. Not like Joseph's trembling, not fear or overwhelm, but like something was moving through me, using me, speaking me. I felt my spine straighten, my head tipped back, my eyes rolled up until all I could see was the inside of my own skull, and then not even that, because suddenly I wasn't alone in my body anymore. I saw her first, a woman with dark skin and eyes lined with kohl, standing in a temple made of white stone. Water pooled at her feet, warm, sacred, and she was singing. Not words, just sound. The same sound rising from my throat now, Ninsara. The name came to me like something I'd always known but had forgotten. She turned, looked at me, and I felt her inside me, not watching, but being. Her hands were my hands. Her voice was my voice. And I understood. She had stood in circles like this. She had spoken in tongues like this. Before they cut out her tongue. Before they renamed her. Before they made her a ghost. Then another woman, wild-haired, covered in mud and blood, standing in a forest so old the trees had no names. Bruna. She was running. No, she was hunting. And she was singing too. The same syllables pouring from my mouth now. A dirge. A war cry. A refusal. I felt her rage burning in my chest. Not hot, but cold, precise. The rage of a woman who had learned that the best revenge is refusing to disappear. Then another. A woman on the plains, her hair long and black, a white falcon on her arm. Luoa. She was singing to the wind, the eastern wind, and the wind was singing back. I felt her grief like a stone in my throat. The grief of watching everything sacred be systematically killed, her children taken, her language forbidden, her ceremonies outlawed. But still, she sang, in secret, in the dark, keeping the memory alive in her body when her mind was forced to forget. And then more. Women I didn't have names for. Women in robes of white and red. Women with painted faces. Women with bound feet. Women with scars on their backs. Women speaking in tongues in temples, in forests, in hidden rooms, in the dark. All of them hunted. All of them silenced. All of them refusing to be erased. And all of them here, in this room, in this circle, speaking through me. My body convulsed. I felt Sarah's hand grip mine tighter, grounding me, the way I used to ground Joseph. I felt Emma's voice rising beside mine, not the same words, but the same sound, the same ancient, unnameable knowing. And I understood. This was not new. This had always been. Women gathering in circles, women speaking in tongues, women touching something the men could not control, and being hunted for it. Temples burned, priestesses killed, sacred knowledge rebranded as witchcraft, as possession, as sin. But the lineage never broke. It just went underground. It hid in the bodies of women who half remembered without knowing why. It lived in the syllables we spoke when we stopped trying to make sense and just let the sound move through us. I came back slowly. The room solidified around me. The candles, the walls, the sisters' faces wet with tears. My throat was raw. My hands were shaking, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt since I was a girl running through fields with Joseph before the visions came. No, more alive than that. Because this wasn't innocence. This was knowing, bone deep, ancestral, undeniable. Sarah squeezed my hand. "Did you feel them?" she whispered. I nodded. I couldn't speak yet, but I didn't need to, because I could see in her eyes that she had felt them too. We all had. The women before us, the priestesses, the ones who had been hunted for touching what we were touching now. When Joseph found out, he wanted to be there. He said he needed to interpret, that God had given him the gift to understand what we were saying. We didn't want him there, but we couldn't say no, not to the prophet, not to the man who spoke for God, so we let him join. The next time we gathered, he sat in the circle with us. His presence changed everything. The air felt heavier. The candlelight seemed dimmer. But we began anyway. We joined hands, Joseph's palm hot and dry against mine. And we prayed. And slowly, the tongues began to rise. Sarah first, then Emma, then me. The syllables poured out, honey and ash, water and fire. And for a moment, I felt them again. The women, the priestesses, the lineage. And then I felt Joseph. His whole body went rigid. His hand clenched mine so tight it hurt. His breath came in sharp gasps, the same gasps I remembered from our wedding night, from the early visions, from the times when heaven touched him and he didn't know what to do with it. He was trembling. Tears streamed down his face. His mouth opened and sounds came out. Not words, but something raw, something broken, something real. For a moment, just a moment, I thought, he feels it. He's touching what we're touching. He's here with us. But then his eyes opened, and I saw it happen. The shift. The moment the trembling stopped and the certainty began. He reached for paper. His hand, no longer shaking, grabbed the pencil we kept on the table for writing down revelations. "Wait," he said. His voice was steady now, controlled. "I need to write this down." The tongues faltered. One by one, the sisters fell silent. Only I kept speaking. Because I couldn't stop. Because the words were still pouring out. Because the women were still there, still trying to speak through me. But Joseph wasn't listening to the sound anymore. He was listening to something else, something in his own head. "I understand it now," he said. He was writing furiously, his hand moving across the page with the same certainty he used when he translated scripture. "The spirits are confirming the principle of celestial marriage. They're saying that plural wives are part of God's design, that the women who speak in tongues are the elect, the ones who will be exalted in the celestial kingdom." He looked up. His eyes were bright, not with tears anymore, with certainty. "This is a sign," he said, "a confirmation. God is speaking through you to validate what he's already revealed to me." I felt it die, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a candle snuffed out. The presence that had filled the room, the wild, ancient, unnameable thing that had moved through us. It was gone. The syllables on my tongue turned to ash. The women, Ninsara, Bruna, Luoa, all of them, pulled back. Not because they wanted to, but because there was no space left for them. Joseph had filled the room with his interpretation, his doctrine, his need to make it mean something that served him. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I understood. It wasn't that he was lying. He believed what he was saying. He genuinely thought God was speaking through him. But that was the problem. He couldn't hold mystery. He couldn't sit with the unknowing. He couldn't let something be sacred without naming it, claiming it, systematizing it into doctrine that elevated him. The trembling had been his last thread of humility. The fear had been the thing that kept him tethered to something real. But now he was certain. And a man who is certain that everything he wants is what God wants is a man who has stopped listening to anything but his own hunger. I felt something inside me recoil. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just a cold, clinical recognition. He is broken. Not evil. Not malicious. But broken in a way that makes him dangerous. Because he genuinely cannot tell the difference between the sacred and his own need to control it. When we spoke without him, it was freedom, wild, alive, untamed. But when he interpreted, it became a cage, a doctrine, a justification for everything he wanted to do anyway. The sisters looked at me. I could see it in their eyes. They felt it too. The death of the thing we had touched. The way his words had killed the magic. But no one said anything. Because what could we say? He was the prophet, he spoke for God, and we were just women trying to make sense of something we weren't supposed to understand without him. After that night, I stopped inviting him. The sisters and we would gather in secret again. When he was away, preaching in another town, meeting with the elders, visiting one of the other wives. And we would speak, and the presence would return. The women, the priestesses, the lineage. They would flood through us again, wild, untamed, refusing to be named or claimed or systematized. And in those moments, I understood. The sacred doesn't need interpretation. It doesn't need doctrine. It doesn't need a man to tell us what it means. It just needs space, silence, presence, and the willingness to let it remain a mystery. The children came. Not just mine, but the other wives too. Joseph's children, born in secret, denied in public. My youngest daughter looked like me, dark hair, wide eyes, a mouth that curved like a question. Joseph would hold her at night, singing to her, calling her his treasure. But in the daylight, when the congregation gathered, he would barely look at her. He denied her, denied all of them, told the world he had only the children from his first marriage. The rest were ghosts, shadows, secrets he kept locked in the rooms of women who were not allowed to speak. I watched him with the newer wives, the way he touched them tender at first, reverent, as if their bodies were scripture. But then the tenderness would fade, and he would move to the next, and the next, always reaching, always claiming, always using the language of God to justify his hunger. I didn't hate the other wives. I loved them. We were sisters in truth, bound not by his theology, but by our shared witnessing of what he was becoming. We held each other's children, we sang each other's songs, we wept together in the dark, and we spoke in tongues when he wasn't there to interpret. Because in the speaking, we were free. In the speaking, we were priestesses. In the speaking, we remembered something he could never touch. The mobs came. First in Ohio, then Missouri, then Illinois. They called us heretics, seducers, deceivers. They said Joseph was a false prophet, that he used God's name to justify his lust. They burned our homes, they drove us from town to town, they threatened to kill him. And I felt something strange, a bone-deep knowing that this had happened before. Not to me, not in this life, but somewhere, somehow. I felt the weight of other women who had been hunted for touching something sacred, women whose temples had been burned, women whose tongues had been cut out, women whose children had been taken. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, a thread pulling through time, a memory that lived in my blood. When they arrested him, I knew he would die. Not because God told me, but because I could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain. They took him to Carthage jail. I tried to see him, but they wouldn't let me in, so I stood outside, watching the windows, feeling the inevitability settle into my bones. The mob came at dusk. I was standing in the street below, my shawl pulled tight against the June heat, watching the second-story window where I knew he was. The air smelled like gunpowder and sweat, like fear. I heard the first shot, sharp, cracking the evening open like an egg. Then another. Then the sound of glass shattering, high and bright and wrong. I saw his body appear in the window frame, white robes, dark hair, his face turned toward the sky as if he were looking for something he'd lost. For a moment, he seemed suspended, caught between earth and heaven, between the boy and the prophet, between what he'd touched and what he'd tried to own. Then he fell. The sound. God. The sound. Not a thud, not something soft or distant, but a crack. Bone meeting earth, flesh giving way, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth, in your ribs, in the hollow of your throat. I ran. My feet were moving before I understood what I was doing. The crowd was thick. Men with guns, women screaming, children being pulled away. I shoved through them, elbows in ribs, hands grabbing at my dress, someone shouting, "Don't let her near him!" But I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I reached him, he was on his back. His white robes were blooming red. Not all at once, but slowly, like ink spreading through water. 4 bullet wounds, one in his chest, one in his shoulder, 2 in his back. His arms were spread wide, palms up, as if he were still reaching for something he couldn't name. His face. Oh God. His face. It was the boy's face. Not the prophet who stood in pulpits and commanded revelation. Not the man who moved between our beds with steady hands and hunger. But the boy. The one who used to stop mid-stride to watch hawks circle overhead. The one who cried on our wedding night because he felt God in my body. The one who trembled when heaven touched him. His eyes were open. Still alive. Still seeing. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his chest, not knowing where to touch, where to press, how to stop the bleeding that was taking him from me. "Joseph," I whispered. His eyes found mine, and I saw it all. The boy who reached for my hand in the fields. The man who learned to use God's voice to justify his desire. The prophet who touched something real. The husband who couldn't stop reaching for more. I saw the divine he'd touched, still there, flickering in his eyes like candlelight, and I saw the corruption, the way he'd tried to own it, to control it, to build a kingdom with himself at the center, both, at the same time, the sacred and the profane, the boy and the man, the trembling and the hunger. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice was so small, like a child's, like the boy who used to ask me if I thought God made each petal separately, or if he just thought flower and it knew what to become. I wanted to say something, to tell him I forgave him, to tell him I loved him, to tell him I understood. But my throat was closing, my hands were shaking, and all I could do was reach for his face, my fingers tracing his cheekbone, his jaw, the curve of his bottom lip, the way he touched me the first time he kissed me. His hand lifted, trembling again, the way it used to, and found mine. He squeezed. Once. Then his grip went slack. His eyes stayed open, but the light behind them went out. I don't know how long I knelt there. The crowd was shouting. Someone was pulling at my shoulders. Someone else was saying, "He's gone, sister. He's gone." But I couldn't move. I couldn't let go of his hand, because if I let go, it meant he was really dead. It meant the boy was gone. It meant I would never again see him stop mid-stride to watch a hawk, or hear him ask questions that made the world feel holy. It meant I had lost him, not to doctrine, not to other wives, not to the corruption of power, but to death. Final. Absolute. Irreversible. They pulled me away, eventually. My dress was soaked with his blood. My hands were red. I looked down at them. These hands that had held his when we were children, that had braided our daughter's hair, that had joined with the sisters in circles of speaking. And I understood. He had touched something real, something divine, something that burned like fire and honey, but he couldn't keep his hands off it. He couldn't just be with it. He had to own it, control it, use it to build himself into something larger than human. And the same world that had always hunted priestesses, that had always feared women who spoke with God, had killed him for it. Not because he was a prophet, but because he had touched the sacred and tried to make it his. I did not mourn him the way the others did. I did not call him martyr. I did not build monuments to his memory. But I did not forget him either. I carried him, not the legend, not the doctrine, but the boy, the human, the one who saw angels and didn't know what to do with the weight of it. And I carried the sisters, the ones who spoke in tongues with me, the ones who held my children, the ones who loved me in the spaces he left empty. I carried the memory of what was real, the communion, the speaking, the presence that moved through us when we gathered in circles, hands joined, voices rising. That was sacred. That was priestess knowledge. That was the lineage he tried to claim, but could never own. I do not know if I will be remembered, if I have a name in the histories. I am one of many a wife, a shadow, a woman who stood beside a prophet and watched him fall. But I remember. I remember the boy who trembled. I remember the sisters who spoke in tongues. I remember the children born in secret. I remember the thread that pulled through time, the feeling that this had happened before. That women like us had always been hunted for touching the sacred. That we had always been silenced. That we had always been erased. But we had never disappeared. I do not know the names of the women who came before me. I do not know their stories. But I feel them, in my bones, in my blood, in the words that rise from my throat when I speak in tongues. They are there, waiting, remembering, refusing to be forgotten, and I will not forget. I will carry the memory not of the prophet, but of the priestesses, the sisters who spoke with God and needed no man to interpret, the women who loved each other in the spaces doctrine could not touch, the ones who remembered even when they were told to forget. I am unnamed, but I am not erased. I am the witness, the keeper, the one who refuses to let the story end the way he would have told it. I am the half-remembering, the bone-deep knowing, the thread that will not break. And I am here, still speaking, still remembering, still free.